Hey guys, this is Grandmaster Eugene Perelshteyn, and we're gonna try to prepare you against the Catalan opening that a lot of strong players recommend. So the Catalan is after d4, knight f6, c4, e6, g3. This is the opening that a lot of top players use, especially Magnus Carlsen recently took up this opening. Very, very annoying opening to face. So I will recommend to you to avoid entering the main lines that start with the move d5, because most likely your opponent knows what to do, and it requires a lot of preparation, a lot of theoretical knowledge. So instead, I'm going to recommend to you an opening that you can play against knight f3 or g3, which saves a lot of time. This is called the Bogo Indian, or the Bogo, with the move bishop to b4 check. Very easy opening to play. You get the bishop outside of this pawn chain with c7, d6 that eventually you want to try to build. So it's not getting stuck on f8 or e7. Later you're going to castle. So notice that you can play this move against knight f3 as well. And this is how the Bogo, classical Bogo, is played. You protect the bishop. Even if they play g3, you play knight c6. That will actually most likely transpose from the Catalan. So if we were to go back to the Catalan move order, if they start with g3, bishop check, right? The most common move is to block with bishop to d2. Again, you can play queen e7. They play either bishop g2 or knight f3. And for instance, if bishop g2, knight c6, hitting the d pawn, knight f3, protecting the pawn, and we're right back into the main line of the Bogo. Now, how do you play the Bogo? Very, very easy. Here you have to know that you need to insert the spheric key capture, bishop takes d2. It's imperative to insert that move to discourage white from taking the bishop with the queen. Most common move is knight b takes d2, but let me explain to you why queen takes d2 is not recommended. And it all is sort of hinges upon this idea knight to e4, hitting the enemy queen, queen c2, and queen b4 check. The combo of the knight, queen, and this knight on c6, which also puts pressure on the pawn, makes it really awkward for white to develop. Because if you play knight d2, which is a logical move, after knight takes knight, notice that either of the two captures drops the pawn. Knight drops the d pawn, and queen drops the c pawn. And then white has to castle and try to prove compensation, which is minimal at best. Black scores extremely well, over 57% black win here. So this is not that great. And if white puts knight on c3, after knight takes, pawn takes, drops the c pawn. And if queen takes, we get this very unpleasant endgame for white with the double pawns. We're going to play d6, bishop d7, maybe knight a5, either castle or king e7 with a very comfy endgame. Again, black scores very, very well in this structure. So that's why this is kind of like a trap. Knight has to take on d2. And I've recommended this way in my black book, Chess Openings for Black Explained as well. And now both sides typically castle, and black builds this beautiful c7, d6, e5 pawn chain. If white plays e4, play e5. Again, we've completed our goal. White typically kicks the knight, and the best square is to go back to b8. Knight is actually going to be best placed on c5. We're going to play a5, knight a6, knight c5 with a dream position for black. Also notice the fact that black has a King's Indian-like formation without that King's Indian bishop, which is often stuck behind this pawn, while the g2 bishop is also stuck behind those light pawns, the white pawns on e4, d5, whereas we got a beautiful chain. This bishop is wide open. Black doesn't have any problems at all, and black actually scores really well here. I won game here against 𝐦𝐤𝐤𝐬 in the last round of Fox's Open in 2006, which clinched my last GM norm. So it's a very memorable opening indeed. So let's summarize what we've learned. The way to sidestep the Catalan is to invite white to the Bogo with bishop b4 check. White typically answers with bishop d2, queen e7, and then the key move here is knight c6, knight f3, and to take on d2. And this is again the classic Bogo. They have to take with the knight, both sides castle, and immediately black builds up the beautiful pawn chain with d6 and e5. Any questions so far?
So the main question I have is, if they go bishop b4 check, why don't they do, instead of bishop d2, they go knight c3, blocking the check that way?
Ah, good question. So let's go back here. Yeah, so there are actually two other ways they can block from this check. One is knight c3, as you correctly point out. The other one is knight d2. Both have their drawbacks. So let's talk about knight c3. This is no longer Catalan per se, because this is more like a 𝐦𝐚𝐧𝐭 Indian. Because if you think about this, white can start the game with the 𝐦𝐚𝐧𝐭, and only after bishop b4, play this move g3. This is a well-known line of the 𝐦𝐚𝐽 called the Fianchetto variation. So this is one idea. So usually white doesn't want this because black has many different plans. One of them is to immediately strike the center with c5. d5 is not recommended, right? Because you have this knight e4 idea and you're hitting this knight. You're also thinking about queen f6 to enhance the firepower. And if they don't play this move, if they take here, notice that their structure is collapsing. You can take on c3 at any moment. You can also start with knight a6, pick up that pawn. You're doing great. And finally, the best move is knight f3. Again, this is one of the main lines. Here, again, black has many different ways to get a comfortable game. One of them is pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, and here you can play knight e4. Again, white is having serious issues. And if you play, let's say, queen c2, then black doesn't even have to take on c3, although black could. Black has this cool idea, queen a5, to meet queen takes e4 with bishop takes c3 check. King would have to go to d1 because of pawn takes, queen takes, drops the rook. So this is the reason why a lot of players are not as happy to enter the 𝐦𝐚𝐽𝐽, because of this pin on the knight on c3. And finally, if they play g3, bishop b4 check, knight d2, the drawback of this move, although you don't get your pawns doubled with bishop takes c3 ideas, you are blocking this bishop. And again, black can strike the center with the same exact way, putting pressure on the d pawn. After a3, black typically takes on d2. Notice white cannot really take with the bishop because the d pawn is hit. They have to take with the queen, which is awkward, and to move the queen multiple times in the opening is not great. If queen takes d4, the queen gets kicked around, two knights are already developed, and if queen comes back, now black can strike with d5, c takes d, and here black has several good moves. Black does not mind the IQP because after castle, rook e8, black's going to get a great game. But also, black can play this interesting move, knight to e5. And then, depending on what white does, if queen d4, black can actually even enter this endgame with the two knights like this. So this is a possibility, but I would prefer to play for a win with e takes d, bishop here, fast castling, fast rook e8, and very good play for black. So that, in a nutshell, is how I recommend to meet the Catalan, by playing Bogo Indian, Bogo style chess with bishop b4 check.
So I have another question before we end it. So some people like to do this setup after d4 and f6, c4, e6. People like to go a3 to block this bishop b4 idea entirely. So what do you do about that?
Let's go back and take a look at that. So yeah, this is people who are kind of not liking the Bogo and the 𝐦𝐚𝐽𝐽, right? They don't like the bishop lane here. They play a3. And I've seen a number of people do this. It's actually not that useful move in many other openings. So you can actually play this move c5. because classical Benoni is bad with this useless move, the pawn on a3, because often in the Benoni, black prepares the b5 pawn push, and this a3 pawn belongs on a4. So you can just basically take, and play g6. And this is like a really great Benoni. For example, knight here, bishop here, e4 castles, rook e8, d6. Great counterplay. And of course, long term, your idea is to strike with b5, b4.
Hey, check this video out to make sure that you get more important information to bring your chess to the next level.